Коллеги, здравствуйте. Меня зовут Александр Бондаренко. Я директор переводческой компании TranslAcademy, а также преподаватель перевода Центральноукраинского педагогического университета. Одна из моих миссий в индустрии перевода – это объединение усилий отраслей и переводческих школ для взаимовыгодного сотрудничества. Мы приветствуем вас на очередном вебинаре проекта TranslAcademy. И прежде чем приступим к представлению нашего сегодняшнего гостя, традиционно несколько слов о платформе, на которой будет проходить сегодняшний вебинар. Как мы и анонсировали, наш вебинар синхронно переводится в паре английский-русский. И в нижней части экрана справа вы можете видеть меню «Язык». Оно выпадающее. Если на него нажать, вы сможете выбрать канал с нужным языком. Мы также рекомендуем выключить оригинальный звук, чтобы он не мешал вам слушать перевод. So, dear colleagues, if you prefer to hear me in English, please click the menu language at the bottom of the screen on the right, and you'll be able to select the language you need, English. We also recommend you to mute the original sound to be able to hear. Друзья, сегодня у нас в гостях Барбара Moser-Mercer, профессор университета Женевы и приглашенный лектор университета Найроби, координатор проекта InZone. Цель проекта – обеспечение образовательных потребностей сообществ в конфликтных и кризисных ситуациях. Профессор Moser-Mercer – действующий член АИК и в течение ряда лет руководитель школы устного перевода в Женевском университете. Человек, сделавший эту школу одной из самых успешных и современных школ мира. Сейчас я передаю слово моей коллеге по проекту Ирине Сергеевне Алексеевой, директору Санкт-Петербургской высшей школы перевода, переводчику и преподавателю перевода. Она детальнее расскажет о нашей сегодняшней гости и о нашем проекте, напомню. Ирина Сергеевна, вам слово.
Спасибо. Спасибо, Александр. Сначала, по сложившейся традиции, несколько слов о нашем проекте, который длится с 2014 года. Проект задуман и воплощается для того, чтобы расширить и дополнить наше представление о профессии переводчика и о подготовке переводчиков, потому что эта профессия очень динамична, она не стоит на месте, и наш проект позволяет нам забраться в самые дальние уголки и найти самых недосягаемых людей, которые могут нам рассказать об этой профессии. Вообще я убеждена, что вот такие встречи – это лучший способ актуализации своего профессионального образования. И мы адресуем поэтому наши встречи и переводчикам, и преподавателям перевода, и менеджерам, которые организуют перевод. И у нас бывают и совершенно никому неизвестные какие-то школы и программы, и бывают такие люди, как наши сегодняшние гости. Я безумно рада приветствовать здесь, у нас, в TranslAcademy, Барбару Moser-Mercer. Я думаю, что мало найдется у нас людей, которые знают что-то о переводе и не знают Барбару Moser-Mercer. Она автор научных публикаций и по психолингвистике, и по когнитивной психологии, в частности, по аспектам обучения билингвов. И результаты ее теоретических исследований стали основой интерактивных курсов для студентов Африки, для студентов Средней Азии. Но самое главное, коллеги, это то, что Барбара всегда первооткрывательница, она всегда осваивает новое и всегда создает новое. Барбара Мозер – одна из создательниц АИК, а не только член АИК. И именно при ее руководстве Женевская школа перевода ЭТИ стала известной на весь мир. И именно с этой школы, признаюсь я вам, мы брали пример, когда создавали свою Санкт-Петербургскую высшую школу перевода. Ну и, конечно, то, что Барбара сегодня нам расскажет, надо обратить на это особое, пристальное внимание, потому что то, что она говорит, это всегда чревато будущим и очень важно для будущего. Ну, я не буду пересказывать, я хочу, чтобы это как раз рассказала сама наша гостья. В целом нас ждет невероятная встреча с невероятной докладчицей. И еще несколько слов о переводчиках. Вот сейчас некоторые гости волновались, на каком языке все будет. Мы всегда ведем наши встречи на двух языках, английском и русском. И вот так уж повелось традиционно. Эти встречи переводят на волонтерских условиях выпускники Санкт-Петербургской высшей школы перевода. И сегодня у нас особенные звезды. Это Елизавета Мышенкова-Микая, на самом деле ее фамилия сейчас. Она штатный переводчик МИД России. И Сергей Леонов, известный очень переводчик с английским и немецким языками. И, кроме того, блестящий преподаватель Санкт-Петербургской высшей школы перевода. Вот такие у нас сегодня переводчики. И вот на этом я передаю слово нашей гости Барбаре Moser-Mercer. Пожалуйста, Барбара, вам слово.
Thank you very much, Alexander and Irina, for those kind words of introduction. And I've already made a note to myself that, because I will forget it at the end, like many chairs do, to thank Elizabeth and Sergey from the bottom of my heart for offering their services to interpret what I have to say today. It was already a pleasure to meet Sergey during one of the tests the other day. And it's a pleasure to see and meet Elizabeth today. So thank you very, very much in advance. I know I will forget in the end. Thank you also for your kind introductions. And when it comes to thank yous, I will also forget perhaps in the end, but I will start with the thank yous right off the bat. And also thank the University of Geneva for having supported the development of humanitarian interpreting over so many years. I'm no longer associated. I've retired from the University of Geneva. I'm no longer associated with InZone. So while I founded it and directed it for many years, I've moved on. And as Irina and Alexander rightly said, I'm currently visiting professor at the University of Nairobi, but still in the field and very much engaged in humanitarian contexts. So the topic for today, and I will share my screen in a moment, will be humanitarian interpreting. I've been asked to discuss this topic. I have 20 minutes to do so. I've set my alarm. I'm known for going over time, so this is not one of my strengths. I'll try and be as mindful of everyone's time as I possibly can, and maybe, you know, run through some of the slides a little bit faster, but I can actually also make available a handout if you're interested in having the slide, in having a PDF of the slides afterwards. It's a big topic, and I was thinking long and hard about what facet of that topic should I cover, because it's impossible in 20 minutes to cover everything. So I've decided to actually probe into one of the dimensions that are less well known with regard to humanitarian interpreting. One that will also be the subject of a joint publication with other colleagues that will come out later this year. And I will look at a contextual analysis of humanitarian interpreting, looking at what are the contexts and especially what is the legal framework within which humanitarian interpreting is practiced. Because I believe that will also allow you to perhaps get a better sense of what kind of training is needed, what practice looks like, and also how one could advance in developing a framework for professional ethics. So please do not expect a complete coverage of humanitarian interpreting. It's not possible in a short period of time. So my disclaimer right up front is indeed, this is my focus. and I hope I will be able to share with you some details that you may or may not have been entirely aware of. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. I am not able, Alexander, I'm not able to share my screen. Could you perhaps make sure that I have the permission? I'm only seeing your screen.
Мы сделали вас... Да, Барбара, мы сделали вас ко-хостом. Это должно давать вам право.
I know you made me a co-host, but I am still not able to share my screen. I'm so sorry. I do not get the...
Ясно, сейчас, секунду. Будем пробовать что-то сделать.
Okay, I've got it now because I actually had to delete your screen. So yeah, so I've just deleted yours, so it's fine. We're good to go. Sorry for the slight technical glitch. And I hope you can see it now and that everything is good. So interpreting in humanitarian contexts. I think the big kind of overarching concept that I would like to look at this topic from is that communication in humanitarian contexts is absolutely critical and can be considered an important part of aid. I've just, put on the screen an image of a refugee settlement there, a refugee camp. And below that, the result of a participatory action research project, a contextual analysis of what the needs in those camps are, as seen from the refugees' perspective. And communication is one of those big branches of the problem analysis tree. So you can see it is a need that is perceived by refugees and those who are others forcibly displaced. And it is indeed considered to be essential. So looking at communication being aid, communication and community engagement in the area of humanitarian assistance is indeed aid. Communication provides life-saving information that those who benefit from aid and assistance and support can act on. But it really is entirely relying on two-way communication channels. This has been one of the issues that has actually led to the whole development of humanitarian communication and humanitarian interpreting. That it used to be that communication was only one way, and having this two-way opportunity really empowers those who are at the receiving end of assistance and aid. It also gives those who receive aid the possibility to participate actively in the decision-making process about what is actually being done during a crisis and how local capacity could be leveraged properly. And most of all, it keeps people in crisis connected. I had initially wanted to show you a video. I will give you the link at the end and you can watch it at your own leisure, simply because for technical reasons with interpretation, everything, we weren't going to go down that road. Now, let us look at where humanitarian interpreting is practiced. And I think one of the things that I often find is difficult to understand for those outside of the humanitarian enterprise is the entire humanitarian architecture. It is the legal framework and the organizational framework in which humanitarian assistance and emergency relief is coordinated. And you can see the various parts of that coordination mechanism. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs is the key agency responsible for the overall coordination. And I would just like to kind of push you over to the left side, where we have, among other things, camp coordination and camp management, early recovery, education, emergency telecommunications, food security. And on the right side, you have health, logistics, nutrition, protection, shelter, and water, sanitation, and hygiene. And on the bottom, you have the entire timeline from prevention to mitigation to preparedness for disaster, a very important topic that has come to the fore in 2020 during the pandemic, when I think globally we realized that we weren't prepared for a pandemic. Response, recovery, and then reconstruction. And you have mostly the blue part, which is covered by humanitarian architecture. And you have the gray parts where you move into development. So the humanitarian assistance and development assistance, or coordination, as it's more often called now, are not necessarily and automatically linked to each other. And there has been a big movement over the last 15 years in bringing the two together, so that every humanitarian assistance also has its eye on post disaster development, and that any actions and initiatives and any programs that are run during a humanitarian event automatically provide a good foundation for future development coordination. So we overall, we need to ensure that this cluster system, as it's called, provides interpretation in an appropriate language, so that all the cluster partners are able to participate, including the local organizations and the national and local authorities where this is appropriate. And I will talk about this a little more. Another legal framework are the core humanitarian standards. There are quite a number of them, and they govern, as part of the sphere standards, they govern the way in which humanitarian action is implemented and humanitarian programs are being implemented. Then we have the humanitarian principles, and I've put them up: humanity, neutrality, impartiality, accountability, participation, do no or less harm, and respect for culture and customs. The humanitarian principles are actually guarded, so to speak, by the International Committee for the Red Cross. On this one, it's a custodian of the so-called Geneva Conventions. I'm not going to be able to go into all of the details of the history of this, but the four key principles are humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence as part of this. And and these principles can be looked at from a variety of perspectives. We have the humanitarian principles of humanity, and you can see the definitions here. Meant to alleviate human suffering. Then those that are addressing the goals of humanitarian action, being fair to everyone, and everyone having equal access to humanitarian assistance. Then there are there are the political principles, and this is perhaps a little less important for humanitarian interpreting, but important for the ICRC, being inside a conflict without being invested in it. Although the principle can actually be transferred very, very easily into developing professional ethics for humanitarian interpreters. And then we have the dignity principles of participation, respect, and empowerment. So you will most unlikely hear me speak about beneficiaries, although it is one of the terms that is being used extensively in humanitarian action, simply because beneficiaries labels those who are at the receiving end of humanitarian assistance as less powerful, powerless, and not having a voice. And I think especially we as interpreters are very keen on voices being heard, and it is our job to allow those voices to be heard by everyone through our capacity of being able to transition from one language to another. Participation, respect, and empowerment, I'm then coming back to that in a minute. We also have the stewardship principles of sustainability and accountability. Yeah, that we need to use our resources wisely and that we assume responsibility for actions in the immediate and the longer term. I think the long history of colonial rule has hopefully taught all of us a thing or two. It is important to have upward accountability, but also downward accountability. We're not just accountable to donors and governments and actors. We're most importantly accountable to the people with whom we work and the population that is being that relies on the kind of support that we provide. And that brings me also to the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit and the so-called Grand Bargain commitments. It was at the World Humanitarian Summit that governments and international organizations and development agencies and donors came together. And they realized that the time had come to talk about participation and localization of humanitarian action. And I think it's something that the pandemic that started last year has critically emphasized, that the moment we can no longer travel, the moment the actors can no longer go to the field, at that very moment, it is local capacity that is called upon to support any kind of relief effort. And I think it's become very painfully clear to a lot of people this last year that they haven't invested enough in local capacity. That this whole globalization approach, where the global north basically has held most of the power and the purse strings, is backfiring. And that those who have been listening to the commitments and reading the commitments of the Grand Bargain have ultimately done much better, because they made participation and localization part of their development from the start, and were then, during the pandemic, able to rely on that capacity that they had already built. But I think it's a really important reminder also for interpreter training, and especially humanitarian interpreter training, to emphasize the localization and the local, not just participation, but the localization of training, and to not centralize training in a few schools that are far removed from humanitarian conflicts. So those training courses should happen where the conflicts are mostly occurring, and I will get back to that later on. I'm not going to go into more detail about the Grand Bargain, but you can read up on it, and when you get the handout, you can also, look further into what these commitments are and who the member states are and the NGOs that actually signed up to it. Suffice it to say that we're still far removed from from the results that the Grand Bargain was trying to achieve. But I think the pandemic is perhaps the one positive consequence of the pandemic, is that it has brought home that realization that things need to happen locally and that people need to be empowered locally. A quick word about what is called the Nexus, Humanitarian Development Nexus, meaning that whatever initiative you launch today should have a dimension of sustainability. So we're not going to spend all of our money now and then leave. not leaving any capacity, not making sure that these initiatives have a future. So this runs under the big topic of the humanitarian development nexus, and you can also read up on this. There's further reading available on this. So to close, with this more legal framework, you've now seen that the humanitarian sector is divided up in clusters, that there is a coordination at global level, and that these global coordination structures are replicated in countries that find themselves either in conflict or in conflict-affected settings within countries or in refugee hosting countries, etc. It is linking the effort with the community. And this is where the interpreting activity is focused on. But the interpreting activity focuses on these initiatives that are taken within the legal framework of the UN cluster system and the humanitarian principles that apply as a legal framework in those post-conflict or conflict settings still. So humanitarian interpreting happens not in a legal vacuum. Yeah, it is governed by an entire set of legal frameworks and organizational and architectural frameworks that are quite different from conference interpreting, for example, or other forms of community interpreting. The community engagement, to now funnel it down to what are the topics and the areas in which humanitarian interpreters will need to engage in. You've now already seen the upwards and the downwards accountability, especially the downwards accountability requires that interpreters get involved in anything that has the forcibly displaced participate, where they can provide feedback, where they can lodge complaints, where they require information, there is dialogue, education programs, protection programs, where connectivity is necessary, and where services are being coordinated. So these are the broad areas, and they are indeed very broad. So an interpreter in a humanitarian context can cover the gamut of topics and issues. How does multilingual communication now support the resilience of those who are affected by crisis? A lot has been said about resilience, and it is indeed a very important dimension of how we cope with adverse events. And I think many people are now talking not just about COVID as a health crisis, but also as a mental health crisis. It's been going on for a long time. People have been locked down and locked up for a long time. Kids have been out of school. It does have significant negative consequences on mental health. So how can we guard against some of this? Well, it is through information, consultation, involvement, collaboration, and ultimately community leadership. Again, bringing things down to the ground. And that means that the languages on the ground have to be understood, and that there has to be a two-way communication between those who are providing the whole infrastructure of support in crisis contexts and those who actually need to collaborate with those international actors usually, or national actors, in order to make sure that any kind of support really reaches those people that need to be reached. So let us look at the characteristics of humanitarian interpreting. There are 4 key characteristics. The fragility of the operational environment, and I think I've been able to make that clear. Then interpreting in situations of human suffering, the people who are affected by these crises are people who suffer both physically but also emotionally in most instances. And I'm sorry to use the beneficiaries in this particular paragraph here, but the beneficiaries of the services of humanitarian interpreters are usually under what we call protection Protection is a key principle, and it is the key mandate of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, is the key protection agency and under international humanitarian law. And there is an absence of occupational structure. Humanitarian interpreters are not in any kind of professional organization yet, and this is obviously something that we will be talking about a little bit as well. So those would be the four key characteristics of humanitarian interpreting. Now, when and where are translators and interpreters in humanitarian settings needed? Quite often the distinction isn't made between translators and interpreters, so I am now using both terms in a way interchangeably so that we understand that sometimes those who are basically recruited for those services are not interpreters per se, they're translators, or they're not even translators, as we will find out. I've done a little word bubble here, and what stands out is that interpreters really are engaged in supporting the community, in supporting meetings, in sessions, supporting refugees, involved in surveys, needs analyses, gap analyses, household visits, etc. And we will also hear from practicing humanitarian interpreters the areas in which they work. Here is another big list of when and where translation and interpreting are needed. Program information that is shared with people in need, those who are receiving support, accountability messages, making sure that those in need know where they can find information, where can I find food, when is the next food distribution, where is the next health post, which field post do I need to go to, etc., etc. And then news they can use, where can I charge my mobile phone, what kind of connectivity will be available. So those can be both larger program sessions where a large number of participants are being gathered. And with a megaphone, somebody will be distributing the information. Community radio is a very, very important part. Radio has proven to be a lifesaver during the COVID pandemic this last year in many humanitarian settings. We've seen the comeback of radio, but emergency radio has always been key. So interpreters work on radio, just like remote simultaneous interpreters are working, in order to make sure that public health and safety information is being distributed. But this information can also be distributed via SMS, text messages, and I will mention Translators Without Borders in a minute, who've been doing a great deal of work in that area. A lot of work that involves interpreting also is the feedback channels. So the upward the downward accountability requires that actors do listen to the community and their leaders, and this is where interpreting is needed. Training opportunities. There are some non-formal offline and online training opportunities. I'll start, obviously, kind of with a bias. Yes, the University of Geneva in Zone and colleagues there. I would like particularly to mention Barbara Delahaye and Emanuele Sebastiani, who were instrumental in developing the 2-hour online course that is freely available, downloadable, usable from the InZone website. I believe it's still accessible. And that gives you really a 2-hour self-training, very quick overview. With a simulation environment of a natural disaster, humanitarian emergency, so not a conflict setting. Then we have a big handbook that was also developed together with colleagues from the University of Graz, interpreters in asylum procedures. This is a big handbook that is now published by UNHCR, and it really is a very, very detailed compendium and looks much more into the asylum side of things, and refugees coming to Europe, and how the asylum procedures are being handled within the European Union, European countries. Then there is another online course by FutureLearn. University of Glasgow is also offering a short course on that learning platform. Translators Without Borders also has its own course, a training course on humanitarian interpreting. You need to sign up and provide. So these are non-formal, offline and online possibilities that allow you to kind of be initiated. I'm sure I've missed out on a few others. I think there are individual modules here and there, probably embedded in other community interpreting programs. And I think one task that we have to engage in is really do a complete mapping of those. But I'm now coming back to the localization agenda and the World Humanitarian Summit and the importance of localizing training. It's not it obviously is a bit difficult if we are trying to train humanitarian interpreters, let's say in a country where there is absolutely no conflict and whose languages are not really absolutely crucial in conflict settings. And then expect that the interpreters that are trained would then be flying into humanitarian context to provide their service. That is not how humanitarian interpreting is practiced. It is practiced often and majority of cases by those who are themselves affected by conflict and who happen to have some background in different languages, including English, which is, I think, in the majority of cases, the language of humanitarian action, other than French and Spanish, the other, and Arabic. Those are big languages in humanitarian action now. And it is therefore important that in those conflict-affected regions of the world, the capacity is being built locally to train humanitarian interpreters, improve their professional competency and their skill sets, so that they are available right where they are, and because that is where they're needed. And as you can see now, with all the travel restrictions and any internationals not being able to fly around the globe anymore, it is even more crucial that those regions of the world that are affected by conflict are proactive in developing the capacity for humanitarian interpreting. And I'm showing you just two of the programs in two of the world's regions that are unfortunately and have been for a long time affected by violent conflict and ongoing conflict, one of them being the Middle East, North Africa region, and the other, the Horn of Africa. And you have two programs here, the one offered by Yarmouk University, which was also co-developed by the University of Geneva for the interpreting part. But that program focuses on humanitarian interpreting and translation, very important, and it's just coming up to the end of its first edition. The other one is based on an existing center for translation and interpreting at the University of Nairobi, which had already been involved for many, many years in a Pan-African Masters in Conference Interpreting initiative. And I think Irina knows quite a bit about that as well. So they're a diploma in community interpreting with a very heavy focus on humanitarian interpreting, has just been launched as part of the network of African universities for higher education in emergencies. The applicants and those who are admitted are refugees and IDPs, and in Jordan, refugees and vulnerable Jordanians. So that is also part of some of the legal framework that one needs to follow. So creating a bilingual learning environment goes through different stages to develop these courses and to make sure that other education initiatives become multilingual. In those conflict settings, you go through a number of phases. You do a context analysis, a language needs analysis. You look at what is the available capacity. You provide basic interpreter training. You then do a translation and revision of learning materials. This can be done by refugees. CAT tools training is really essential there. You select the tutors that will support the learning and training effort. You provide advanced interpreter training, and ultimately you go into a launch phase of a bilingual, multilingual course that can be supported by interpreters. And these courses can be very short courses, modules where, for example, local health staff are being trained to respond to a particular health crisis, or community support personnel for psychosocial support, for example, would be trained, and interpreters are providing the multilingual dimension. There are, in any kind of training effort that happens in conflict and crisis affected settings, there are minimum standards. There is a huge international network for education in emergencies with about 17,000 members. And you can see the minimum standards for education in emergencies are available in multiple languages, including Russian. And I think many people, who want to do good and want to launch some initiatives in these settings, do so without understanding the legal frameworks and without understanding that even for training, there are standards. And these standards are intimately linked to the core humanitarian standards as well. So you cannot just go and launch something. You really do need to understand the framework in which you're working. Now, I do have these audio recordings, videos actually, but again, I wanted to make sure that we weren't running into any technical glitches. So I've transcribed the contributions of three former students who be trained as humanitarian interpreters, and I just want to read their testimonials to you, and that will be the end of my presentation. So Vestine, who by now has been resettled to Canada, I became a humanitarian interpreter because I myself needed an intervention and I needed to help my people. The most satisfying experience was seeing the world through the eyes of my people and help them. And the hardest was to understand the culture behind their stories and to make sure I transferred these faithfully. The most important aspect of learning is lots of practice and maintaining high ethical standards. Confidentiality is very important, as people can be at risk if you don't apply the highest level of confidentiality. Let me move to the next one. Here we have Ahmed Abdi. I am a humanitarian interpreter and translator by profession and have been doing this job for the past 8 years. I'm currently based in Niger, West Africa, where I work with UNHCR in refugee operations. My working languages are Somali, which is my mother tongue, and English. In my work, I interpret refugee and asylum seeker interviews, refugee status determination interviews, refugee registration interviews, child protection interviews, and resettlement interviews. I also interpret in counseling and sensitization sessions and during field operations that occur in refugee camps. I also work with UNHCR partners in this operation and the government as well. The last, Fartoon Abbas, why I became a humanitarian worker. Fartoon, in the meantime, is resettled in the United States. We had few jobs in the refugee camp, and we did not have a choice to become whatever we wanted. And I applied and I got the job at UNHCR, and I was lucky to have found this human saving job. The work benefited my own people. The most satisfying for me is to see my client at the airport leaving refugee camps for resettlement. And I really felt proud at that moment because I really interpreted well and their case was heard by the other party. The most challenging thing about my job is the emotional and mental challenge I face because I feel helpless and hopeless when I hear all the suffering of my people. Too many cases are rejected because of the limited spaces, and I sometimes cry because the cases were so heavy and hard to listen to. That was a sad moment for me. The most important part of my training is my note-taking skills, and then being able to call myself a professional interpreter, because we were always called refugee interpreters in the field. The skill that I gained from my humanitarian interpreting is active listening. I use it a lot in my nursing studies now. The ethical standard we use in the refugee camp was important, and I made sure that people don't look up to me and expect me to do something about their case, to get them to understand that I'm not an officer and I cannot do anything about their case. That was difficult. So unfortunately, I would not have had the time to really walk you into the area of professional ethics, which is obviously a very challenging area. And that could be perhaps the topic of another seminar, if there were another one. But I wanted to kind of close with some reflections for you about humanitarian interpreting and just the field in general, that we should proceed from a conviction that actually nobody should be forced to flee, but that in 2020, 80 million were forcibly displaced, that 26.3 million crossed national borders and language barriers, and that their protection, education, livelihoods, and well-being depend on communication. So for trainers of language professionals, we hold the key to a quality response. And thank you for your attention. And I'm afraid I've gone quite a bit over time. And I'll stop sharing so we can, oh yes, I wanted to just, this will be on the handout as well. This is it's a 2-minute film about communication is aid. It's an older one, but it is very, very good. So I just wanted to show you that slide as well.
Спасибо большое, Барбара, огромное. Для меня лично открылся просто целый новый мир. И над этим еще нужно думать, это еще нужно обрабатывать. И, наверное, еще и совмещать с новыми представлениями, которые возникли в период пандемии. Это все очень важно. Теперь я знаю, что у многих есть масса вопросов. Просьба к тем, кто сейчас нас слушает, эти вопросы размещать в чате или как-то доводить их до нашего сведения, чтобы мы могли потом их задать нашей гости. А сейчас по традиции, как всегда, у нас есть с Александром несколько наших вопросов, потому что так или иначе, хотя тема гуманитарный перевод, мы имеем дело с экспертом, которому хочется задать какие-то вопросы и получить на них квалифицированные ответы сегодня. Итак, первый вопрос мой, Барбара, и вопрос следующий. Как, на твой взгляд, что на сегодня еще не изучено в устном переводе?
I'm sure there are many areas that have not received the kind of attention that they probably deserve, and I think new areas arise as the profession evolves. Just from my vantage point, right now, I think one of the areas that I feel strongly about is ethical decision making. And I think especially, of course, related to humanitarian interpreting and just public service interpreting in general. But I also think it is important in conference interpreting. There are there are indeed many times, there have been many times, where as a conference interpreter, you also have to engage in, decision-making, ethical decision-making. And I don't think we've really covered that area very well yet. I know there were a couple of articles. I think Kilian Siebert was co-authoring one at the time with one of his colleagues, but it hasn't received the kind of attention that I think it deserves. I also think that, and this is an ongoing need, the impact of rapidly changing work environments, especially now, with so much being interpreted remotely. And I think also areas that public service interpreting has engaged in quite a bit, but where more study and research is needed, the different scenarios and settings in which interpreting is being used. There is such a huge variety of scenarios, and we live in a world of migration. I have only spoken of forced migration today, but migration in general, economic migration. I mean, the world is still, moving, and I think there is a constant challenge for us as interpreting researchers to not just run after it, but perhaps also be proactive.
Мгм. 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 Мгм.
Спасибо большое,
Спасибо.
Барбара. Прежде чем задать вопрос, я хочу тоже небольшой комментарий дать такой. Вот, разговаривая часто с коллегами на кафедре, мы говорили, ну, в крайнем случае, мы же переводчиков готовим, а не медицинских работников. То есть от нашей профессии человеческие жизни не зависят. Теперь я, к сожалению, так сказать не могу, потому что действительно есть случаи, когда от работы переводчика тоже зависят человеческие жизни. А вопрос такой, нужны ли организации переводчиков и какие именно организации будут полезны для переводчиков, как вы считаете?
I've always been a very strong defender of professional associations. I believe professional organizations advance professional standards and defend them. And they are the watchdogs of the profession. They have an advocacy function and ensure continued professional development. I mean, there are many different kinds of professional organizations, some more active and proactive than others. But I do believe that as a profession, we do need associations, and for all those reasons that I mentioned. And I have always encouraged students to join their professional organization as quickly as they can, because yes, we need, it's a little bit like trade unions. You do need to have a critical mass of members in order to be able to get your voice heard.
Понятно. Ну что, переходим к третьему вопросу. Третий вопрос такой. Вот какой-то человек хочет освоить устный перевод самостоятельно, ведь не все могут где-то учиться. Барбара, это возможно? Возможно освоить перевод, и что вы посоветуете такому человеку, чем заниматься ему самостоятельно?
Yeah, I think up to a point that is possible. And I think the most talented individuals can go quite far in acquiring those skills. I've also shown in one of the slides some of the self-learning, independent learning, online, offline opportunities. But I think at some point, most everyone else will require feedback on their performance at regular intervals to ensure that they do acquire the skills needed of an expert. So I think it is possible up to a certain point. Some can go further than others, but at the highest level, I believe you do need feedback. You do need to be trained.
Понятно, спасибо.
Спасибо за ответ. И следующий вопрос. Барбара, вы значительное время работали в Женевском университете. Что, на ваш взгляд, нужно изменить в системе высшего образования переводчиков? Как, может быть, по-другому чуть-чуть их можно?
Well, I'm not going to, focus as much on the tools as just on the general curricular framework. And I think given the rapidly changing work environments and the rapidly changing scenarios in which interpreters of any kind, whether they are conference or public service or, whatever specialization they pursue, legal, court, and so forth and so on. I think in light of these rapidly changing work environments and scenarios, it's crucial that we do engage in a mapping of the skill sets that are being taught today, that we engage in what in humanitarian context we often call a gap analysis. So where are the gaps? What are the skills that are actually needed today that aren't yet part of the curriculum or the syllabus or the training methods? And that we retool trainers first and foremost to teach effectively and efficiently for the new ways of working. I think, we have to start with the trainers because that obviously amplifies the impact that any change in curricula will have.
Понятно, понятно. Так, теперь вот прозвучало слово «сценарий», значит, освоение профессиональных сценариев. Это подход, который мне лично очень близок в обучении переводчиков. То есть нужно осваивать профессиональные сценарии. А какие-то приемы технические нужно осваивать. То есть, другими словами, обучение должно состоять из освоения сценариев, да, или из приемов, а сценарии уже потом.
That's an interesting, challenging question, and I'll give you my personal reflection on it, because this is, where cognitive psychology meets interpreter training very quickly. And I've always advocated for embedding the skill training in simulations and in real-world scenarios, because that is how they will be most effectively and efficiently acquired and reinforced in memory. So anchored in memory in such a way, they are contextualized. So you associate the setting with the skill, and you can then access those skills and that information very quickly and reliably. So I'm all in favor of always, embedding as much as possible in simulations and not to divorce the skill acquisition from the actual practice. But I think in interpreting, we've really, on the whole, we've done a very good job of this. There's been a huge shift, but even in the very beginning, when you read the annals at the ILO, for example, of how the first interpreters trained themselves, and what did they do? Yeah, they took, the minutes of meetings and protocols and things, and that's what they use. So intuitively, they went down the right path, so to speak. And I don't think that has ever changed. I think the difficulties that translation and interpreting programs had in acquiring university status has actually been this very professional orientation and the simulations. So I would say we've been erring more on the side of embedding in real world scenarios than in making things very abstract.
Спасибо большое, Барбара. Такой вопрос. Каковы наиболее типичные проблемы гуманитарного перевода в условиях кризисов и конфликтов? И нивелируют ли их дистанционные способы коммуникации или усугубляют? То есть удаленка помогает или наоборот мешает?
Well, from the many years in which I've now been involved in either training on site in those settings and working with humanitarian interpreters, I think I would say key problems are language transfer. The language proficiency level of humanitarian interpreters is often not at a level where interpretation is easy. The understanding of one's role, there are a lot of power dynamics in humanitarian contexts, and I've tried to kind of show you with this upward and downward accountability, just how crucial these power dynamics could be. But I think also the testimonials of those of these three interpreters have highlighted the crucial importance of role. And it's not my role to help you. Yeah, it's my role to be to assist you in getting your voice understood or getting your message understood. But no, I'm not the officer, and I don't hold the key to your resettlement. And those have been huge issues in humanitarian settings where the power dynamics are very, very, very difficult to manage, also for interpreters. In addition to that, ethics, emotions, and as I said, power relations. I think those would be the key. Not a lot of humanitarian interpreting is done online. It's something that we're now beginning to develop and to see what kinds of remote tools and platforms are robust enough and fit for low resource environments. Because you have to understand, even if you're in a UN compound in any kind of crisis context, your connectivity might be okay, but it might just go totally out the window an hour later, or the power is cut for everyone. So it's not a tool that one could ultimately rely on for the simple reason of connectivity. But we're looking at ways in which, especially for some of the rare languages and dialects, as you know, a lot of those who require humanitarian interpreting assistance speak dialects of languages that most of us have never heard of. So there are only a few interpreters available, and remote obviously opens up opportunities to guarantee language support when otherwise it would not be available.
Понятно. Барбара, мой последний вопрос, состоящий из двух половин. Вот с когнитивной точки зрения, в чем отличие между устным последовательным переводом и синхронным переводом? Да? И вот интересно, в гуманитарном переводе употребляются ли оба вида или только последовательно? Это вторая половина.
Okay, we're looking at my watch, and I'm afraid some of the participants may have to leave. We're up to the hour. I'll try to be succinct. It's a long question. I think it could also be categorized under the first question that you asked me about what are the under-researched areas in interpreting. And I think, yes, comparing simultaneous and consecutive might be one area that has not received a great deal of attention. There are some Chinese colleagues who are looking at this a little more in detail now. But on the whole, there hasn't been a great deal of work comparing the two. You know, if I'm looking at it from a cognitive point of view, then, and within the framework of, you know, working memory and attention that are very, very intricately related. And if we consider that working memory is an activated portion of long-term memory, and in some sense provides the focus of attention and manages the control processes in the brain, we can at least advance a hypothesis that the capacity of that focus of attention, which we know is limited, although there are some arguments against that, but I think on the whole, we need to say it's limited, and that the simultaneity of processes in simultaneous interpreting taxes those limits more than in consecutive. Simply because in simultaneous, these processes run in the same modality. It's the same language channel that is being used. Whereas in consecutive, you have a bit more of a separation of modalities, and hence those constraints are probably not as painfully felt as they would be in simultaneous. So to me, that kind of makes for the cognitive difference between simultaneous and consecutive. But as I said, I've just tackled this now from the point of view of working memory and memory processes, and not necessarily now from, you know, any other practical way of doing consecutive or simultaneous. I think it's easier to forget, you know, information that has not been brought into the focus of attention, you know, in one form of interpreting than it is in another. So I'm just looking at it from a memory point of view, and even at that, from a working memory point of view. The second part, speaking of forgetting, if you could just jog my memory on the second part of your question.
Вторая часть вопроса о том, какой из этих видов перевода в гуманитарном переводе сейчас вот в Африке встречается? Встречается ли синхрон или только последовательно?
It is mostly consecutive, whispered simultaneous, and there I've yet to see simultaneous equipment anywhere. So it is consecutive, but whispered simultaneous, and under conditions that I don't wish to elaborate on. They are very taxing, you know, on your on the quality of what you hear, but it is mostly consecutive, and at that it is still by those who haven't been trained sentence by sentence.
Ясно. Спасибо.
Спасибо, Барбара. И теперь последний вопрос от меня, и я думаю, мы еще затронем несколько хотя бы вопросов от зрителей наших. А вопрос такой. Есть ли какие-то личные и личностные характеристики, которые позволяют стать хорошим устником или которые препятствуют этому?
Well, not an exhaustive list, but I would say, and not in a necessarily in any order of priority, but just off the top of my head, I would say integrity, humility, adaptability, resilience, speed, curiosity, and eagerness and openness to learn about any topic under the sun, and the ability to multitask. that I think would be some of the traits that I would highlight. Under the less desirable ones, I'm just judging by what I've seen in students who have struggled to really become good interpreters. I think less desirable is dwelling on mistakes, being a perfectionist, or seeking attention for oneself. I think, we continue to be members of a service provision profession. And I think that in itself might be a bit of a challenge for some people who feel being an interpreter, you are this glorious individual from the very early days of the Coming Care brothers, and who have had that stature of glory almost. I mean, that has long gone. We're behind screens and behind glass. But yes, I think in community interpreting, in many cases, interpreters are not behind screens and behind glass. And in humanitarian settings, they're not at all invisible. They are very, very visible, indeed. So not a complete list.
Барбара, у нас есть целый ряд вопросов от аудитории. Часть из них в рубрике «Вопросы и ответы». Как вам будет удобно? Может быть, вы сами посмотрите, там есть достаточно объемные вопросы, и выберите, какие более интересные для вас будут для ответа. Или же нам озвучить несколько вопросов.
I opened the Q&A part, and I see some colleagues who I know. Wonderful to see you online. Yes, any suggestion interpreting courses to offer communication aid to migrants and refugees crossing the Mediterranean from Libya and detained in detention centers in Malta, Italy, and Greece? Yes. It is actually a project that we started to look into, and I'd be happy to get in touch with you, Joseph, again. I've done quite a bit of research on whatever one could possibly find publicly about the detention centers. I've also spoken with interpreters we trained who now work with refugees who have returned to Africa and who had been held in detention centers in Libya, to understand what the options are to train these people. But I think we could continue that discussion offline if you agree, and see, what could possibly be done. Because it is crucial. It is absolutely essential. You have a hodgepodge of languages that are spoken by refugees who attempt the crossing or being forcibly returned, etc. It is a big issue. Question by Jonathan Ross, a broad question. Have you observed that the COVID-19 pandemic has had much of an impact on the mode of interpreting in humanitarian settings? More precisely, have you noticed an increase in the use of remote interpreting in place of face-to-face? I was surprised and quite shocked to learn from my own research among humanitarian interpreters in Turkey that they're still expected to work face-to-face, thereby exposing themselves to considerable health risks. Indeed, Jonathan, you're right. There is, on the one hand, so many services to the forcibly displaced were seriously cut because there was because agencies would no longer let their staff go to the field. So a lot of that support was actually cut completely, and that obviously obviated the need for interpreting. Those agencies that were still able to send staff occasionally would not have the equipment nor the infrastructure to do remote interpreting, and so decided without knowing what other form they could use of interpreting, would basically go ahead and oblige interpreters to work face-to-face. So it's really also one of the areas we're looking into in terms of what kind of platform is the most robust. And I'd mentioned that before. What's the most robust platform that we could use in terms of portable equipment also that would not default in those low resource environments. And I'm not going to repeat, you know, the whole connectivity issues and the maintenance of equipment, etc. But I've been talking to some equipment suppliers, and I've been looking carefully at some platforms as well. Jane, how has Yarmouth University navigated the university qualification criteria to be able to admit refugees whose qualifications may not meet university entry levels for diploma courses? Yes, Jane, access for refugees and the recognition and verification of credentials for admission to university is a huge issue. There is, fortunately now, based on a very successful Norwegian initiative called NOCUD. So Norway developed a wonderful system of verifying academic credentials of refugees, even if they had no papers in hand anymore, which is very often the case. UNESCO has picked up on this and has developed the UNESCO Qualifications Passport, which has been piloted in Zimbabwe last year and is now also being piloted in, I don't know, I'm not quite sure whether it's Ethiopia or whether it's even Kenya. I'll have to double check now. But I think we're kind of moving in the right direction. We have legal foundations in education is a human right. So anyone, you know, should have access to it. In the case of Kenya, you have it even in the Kenyan constitution that the accessibility to education at all levels, including higher, you know, should be facilitated for refugees. How Yarmouth University did it, I cannot speak on behalf of Yarmouth, but I was closely involved, as you know. The diploma is offered in the Refugee Studies Center, and Refugee Studies Centers, by definition, deal with refugees as students and are navigating this particular problem, you know, with more knowledge and more advocacy tools in their toolbox. So the way the diploma is offered, it is a university diploma, but will still need, in order for students, you know, to gain the full academic credentials, will still need further verification. I will leave it at that. I hope I did not misspeak. And my colleagues at Yarmouth will certainly correct me or provide you with additional information. I have Oksana, maybe I missed it in the presentation. I wonder whether aid to orphans and socially disadvantaged families is considered to be humanitarian area or just social. Oksana, that depends. You know, if orphans and socially disadvantaged families are migrants, then yes, it could be considered in part of the humanitarian area. Otherwise, they fall under the social protection framework of the country in which they are. In many cases, when you apply to donors and you want your program to be and your initiative to be recognized in a refugee hosting country, you also need to include what is often called disadvantaged or vulnerable host country students or persons. Yeah, so often, and this is very much along the lines of the new comprehensive refugee response framework and the global compact on refugees, that countries no longer resettle refugees readily, and we know that. About 80% of the world's refugees are hosted by neighboring countries. Refugees stay usually in the region. Europeans may have felt otherwise in 2015, but no, that figure still holds. The bulk of refugees settle in neighboring countries. And including and integrating mainstreaming refugees into those host countries is now the policy directive at the global level through the global compacts on refugees, and then the International Organization of Migration had another compact, it's a global compact on safe and orderly migration. Christina, what attitude should be adopted by a humanitarian interpreter to be perceived correctly by the people in need of humanitarian protection? To what extent can an interpreter show compassion in order to be trusted but not perceived as a savior? Yes, you put your finger on one of the most crucial issues, I'm afraid. And as you all already saw in Fartoon's statement, she would break down because she was emotionally very, very, very involved. During training, we do quite a bit on stress management, but stress management in the sense of psychosocial, social emotional kind of strategies and tools that interpreters can develop in order to be able to withstand the narratives and to digest the narratives that they have to interpret all the time. The understanding of the role, the definition of the role that interpreters play, and where interpreters are usually considered and often considered by officers as yes, extensions of their role. That is something that has proven to be incredibly problematic, because the more officers feel that interpreters are actually working for them rather than as intermediaries between the clients and the agency, the more the interpreter has been instrumentalized, for the sake of the agency. And that creates a situation where the interpreter becomes vulnerable, because then the clients, beneficiaries, recipients of assistance think, the interpreter actually has a big role to play, and the interpreter can help me. And you saw that in that statement. And that, is a very dangerous kind of situation, because we have known of interpreters being attacked, refugee interpreters being attacked in refugee camps, because the clients believed, well, the interpreter messed up his or her case, did not interpret correctly, etc., or has any kind of influence over the case. So along with training the interpreters must come a training of the officers, of the agencies who use interpreters. It's crucial, because otherwise that ethics dilemma cannot be resolved. Yeah, you've got to work with both sides. You cannot, the interpreters themselves being refugees in most cases don't have the power. So in order to kind of create a more level playing field, you need to work with both sides. Oh, Mohammed, I have a question regarding ethics. Where should the translator or interpreter stand when translating for recognized refugees at job centers, foreign affairs offices, government settings? Should not I help them express themselves better in order to get the help or the support they need? Yeah, we obviously, you always need to adjust to the kind of setting you're in, and if you're in the field, or if you're in a room, or in a small room in a refugee camp, or if you're in government offices, it all depends on what room arrangement is already available. But ideally, the triangle has been considered to be the ideal. Where the interpreter sits in the middle, or stands in the middle, if that's what is being done, and the client and the officer or agent or whoever it is, would be on either side. That is the ideal situation. It also, just from a visual and presentation and visual impression point of view, the triangle makes everyone equal. Yeah. So everyone kind of has the same position in a way. And although we know there are huge power differentials, we also know that the power differentials are hugely responsible for creating ethics issues. So by choosing your positionality, your position properly, you can already alleviate some of that. Ilya, would you mind to suggest online UN interpreter training courses? I know that there are some professional development opportunities for those who have sent their applications to one of the United Nations offices, and those who are selected can participate in further professional development, but I'm not aware of any particular UN interpreter training course. I know the United Nations has a network which the school in St. Petersburg is a member. It's the university network, and I know there are conferences, and I'm not quite sure whether there are continued professional development courses. I have not followed this network lately, so unfortunately I'm not able to go any further. Okay, I've come to the end of the Q&A. Alexander, if you can...
Да, Барбара, есть еще много вопросов в чате, но я боюсь, у нас уже нет времени на их ответ. Да.
К сожалению, время подходит к концу.
Да, совершенно верно. Я только скажу вот участникам, которые задавали вопросы, многие ответы Барбара уже дала в своей презентации. Мы обязательно разошлем всем запись, и вы просто пересмотрите записи и получите ответ на эти вопросы. Мы, наверное, приглашаем Барбару сказать несколько завершающих слов, да?
Да, да.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you again, both, to your initiative and organization, and, to all of those who've made this possible. I know there's work behind the scenes, and once again, thank you to the interpreters, and apologies. I think there were moments I went a little bit fast, and I do not have a written script, as you know. I just have my slides, and I speak with the aid of the slides. So thank you again. I hope it wasn't too taxing. Yeah, I really do want to thank you, because I believe that this is an area of interpreting, yes, I have been keenly interested in for a variety of reasons, and that I've spent many years in now. I also think that many dimensions of interpreting in humanitarian contexts are misunderstood. And I hope that by providing you with the legal framework in which humanitarian interpreter happens, and what the more philosophical and ethical backdrop to all of it is, that I've been able to open your eyes maybe to a new dimension of this. I also want to really thank all the students who are trailblazers now in these various diploma courses, who are acquiring those skills, and hopefully it has sparked some interest. Humanitarian settings can occur within a country, within a region, unfortunately very quickly. And I think if you remember the humanitarian architecture, but also remember the programming cycle that was on the bottom, preparedness is what it takes. So try and be proactive. If there's in any way, some of those of us who've been involved in this can help, be happy to provide further guidance if needed. But on the whole, I my appreciation obviously goes to all the humanitarian interpreters who on a daily basis help humanitarian communication be of quality. So thank you to the audience also. Thank you for showing up today, and looking forward to hearing from some of you, perhaps by email.
Ну, я скажу, если позволите, тоже несколько слов. Мы были счастливы, Барбара, иметь тебя в качестве гостя. Я думаю, что наша связь не прервется, потому что те темы, которые затронуты, они, конечно, будоражат и сердце, и душу. И надо быть абсолютно самоотверженным человеком, чтобы этим заниматься. И нам еще расти и расти до этого состояния. Но вот затронута тема этики, я думаю, что это и будет тем следующим случаем, когда мы обратимся опять к Барбаре Мозер-Мерсер и обсудим эту очень важную тему, которую обычно отодвигают в сторону. И мне очень понравился этот список, который Барбара привела в ответ на вопрос о том, какие качества важны для переводчика. И вы заметили, что на первом месте стояли честность и скромность. Вот эти качества, да, главные, гораздо важнее технических приемов, мне кажется, можно поставить во главу угла для тех людей, больше сотни их гораздо было сегодня, которые участвовали в нашем вебинаре. И я думаю, что это гордость нашей профессии, Барбара Мозер-Мерсер. До новых встреч!
Да, друзья, спасибо большое, Барбара, еще раз большое спасибо синхронистам, еще большее спасибо нашей аудитории, которая выдержала такой длинный вебинар, 1,5-часовый. Уверен, что каждый из присутствующих узнал для себя что-то новое. Я лично, у меня перевернулось представление о профессии, хотя я думал, что меня чем-то удивить уже тяжело будет в индустрии перевода. Спасибо большое еще раз за это, Барбара. И на этом наше общение, напоминаем, с спикером не заканчивается, а только начинается. Мы приглашаем оставлять свои вопросы Барбаре на сайте проекта, в нашей Facebook-группе, а также в Твиттере у нас есть канал. Ваши вопросы будут переданы нашему сегодняшнему гостю, и вы получите на них ответы. Спасибо большое, до новых встреч на проекте TranslAcademy. До свидания.